The security guard's hand was already on her arm before she could say another word. Claire Dawson didn't fight it. She let them walk her through the emergency bay doors, past the rows of plastic waiting chairs, past the nurses who looked away, past the orderly who pretended to check his clipboard. 41 patients watched a 23-year veteran get removed from the building like she'd stolen something. Nobody said a word. Outside, the Oregon sky was the color of old concrete. Claire stood on the curb with her badge in one hand and nothing else, and somewhere above the tree line, the sound started, low and rhythmic, growing louder. She looked up. 5 military helicopters in tight formation, moving fast, moving directly toward Stone Gate Medical Center. Her radio had been confiscated, but she could see the fear spreading through the glass doors behind her. Every screen inside the hospital flickered, every radio went dead at once. And then the armored convoy appeared at the end of Hargrove Avenue, and it wasn't stopping. If this story already has you hooked, I want you to stick with me all the way to the end, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about this woman. Hit follow so you don't miss a single part, drop a like if you're with me, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started the way bad days usually do, quietly and with paperwork. Claire Dawson arrived at Stonegate Medical Center at 6:47 a.m., which was 13 minutes earlier than her shift technically required and roughly 4 hours after she'd actually fallen asleep. She had a coffee in one hand that had gone cold somewhere on the I-84 on-ramp, a stack of incident reports tucked under her other arm, and a tension headache that had been living behind her left eye for approximately 9 days. The automatic doors opened and she walked through, and the ER smelled like antiseptic and stale air, and the particular exhaustion of a place that never fully closes. Ashbrook, Oregon was a mid-sized city that liked to describe itself as close-knit. What that actually meant depended on who was doing the describing. For the hospital board, close-knit meant insulated. For the patients who came through those sliding glass doors, the ones without insurance, the ones who waited 4 hours because the triage system was broken and nobody had fixed it in 8 months, it meant something else entirely. Claire had worked emergency medicine long enough to know the difference between a system that was struggling and a system that was being deliberately run into the ground. Stonegate was the second kind. She'd been filing reports about it for 6 weeks. Nobody had responded to a single one. "Morning," said Priya, one of the overnight nurses, not looking up from the handoff notes. Trauma Bay 2 had a rough one. 43-year-old male, blunt force, internal. They got him stabilized around 3, but the attending wants a second set of eyes on the imaging before sign-off. "I'll look at it," Claire said, dropping her bag behind the station. "Also," Priya said, and her voice did something careful, "Merritt's been in since 8. Claire stopped moving. Priya finally looked up. "I just wanted you to know before you walked into anything." Director Harlan Merritt did not typically arrive at Stonegate Medical Center at 8 in the morning. He arrived at 10, left by 4, spent most of the hours between in his corner office on the administrative floor doing things that nobody on the clinical staff was ever explicitly told about. That he was here now, before the shift change was even finished, meant something had moved. Claire poured the cold coffee down the sink behind the nurse's station and threw the cup away. "Thanks," she said. She had 4 patients to check on before rounds. She did it the way she always did, methodically, quietly, making notes in the margins of her mental checklist that she would later transfer to paper, because the hospital's documentation software had been glitching for 3 weeks, and IT had not come to look at it yet. Room by room, curtain by curtain. She had a 67-year-old woman in Bay 4 who'd come in overnight with chest tightening that the attending had logged as anxiety, but that Claire thought looked more like the early edge of something cardiac. She flagged it. She had a 14-year-old boy in the family waiting area whose mother kept asking about the pediatric consult that had been ordered 6 hours ago and hadn't happened yet. Claire found the bottleneck. The consult request had been entered into the wrong system field and never routed, and fixed it in 4 minutes, which was 4 minutes longer than it should have taken because the fix required her to call 3 people and explain the same thing twice. This was what the job actually was, most of the time. Not the dramatic moments, the constant grinding work of catching what the system let fall through. She was writing up the cardiac flag on the woman in Bay 4 when she heard Merritt's voice in the corridor. "Is she here?" She didn't move. She finished the note. "Miss Dawson." The curtain was pulled aside. Merritt stood in the opening with two people behind him she didn't recognize. Administrative staff, by the look of them, one holding a tablet, one holding nothing and trying to look official about it. Merritt was in his 50s, silver-haired, with the kind of jaw that photographed well at fundraisers. He dressed like he owned the building because, in a meaningful sense, he believed he did. "I'd like a word." "I'm in the middle of a patient note," Claire said. "It'll keep." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the note, finished the sentence, and saved it. Then she stood up. "Where?" He took her to the small conference room off the main ER corridor, which was used for family notifications and apparently this. The two administrative staff followed and stationed themselves just inside the door. Merritt sat down. Claire did not. "We've been reviewing your recent incident submissions," Merritt said. 6 of them, Claire said, over 6 weeks, none of which received a response. "That's actually what I want to discuss." He folded his hands on the table. It was a gesture she'd seen executives use when they wanted to look reasonable while saying something unreasonable. "The reports you filed they're creating problems, Claire, for the department, for the administration. We're in a funding review cycle. External auditors are paying attention to everything right now, and internal noise at this level." "Internal noise," she repeated, "creates exposure for all of us." 2 of those reports flagged medication dispensing irregularities that I believe constitute federal documentation violations. One flagged a triage protocol that I can demonstrate, with data, is contributing to extended wait times for high-acuity patients. She kept her voice even. She'd had this conversation before, in various forms. One flagged a staffing pattern in the overnight ER shift that leaves this department dangerously under-resourced between 2 and 5 a.m. Those aren't internal noise, those are patient safety issues. Merritt's expression didn't change. That was the tell she'd learned. When people like him kept their faces perfectly neutral, it meant they'd already made the decision before the conversation started. "I'm going to ask you to withdraw the reports," he said. The room was very quiet. "No," Claire said. He looked at her the way people look at things that are being difficult. "I want you to understand the position you're putting yourself in." "I understand it fine. You've been here 23 years. You have a good record." He paused, past a certain point. She didn't ask him what that meant. She already knew. There had been an incident 14 months ago, before Merritt's time, before the new administrative structure. A patient had been discharged prematurely due to bed pressure and had crashed at home, and Claire had been the one who'd raised the alarm before the discharge happened. And she'd been overruled, and she'd filed that report too, and the hospital had responded by formally reprimanding her for insubordination rather than addressing the discharge protocol. The patient had survived. The reprimand was still in her file. "The reports stay," she said. Merritt looked at the tablet holder, who looked at the other one, and then Merritt looked back at Claire. "Then I'm going to need you to step away from clinical duties pending a performance review." "On what grounds?" "Insubordination, disruptive conduct, creating a hostile environment among administrative staff." She almost laughed. "I've spent 6 weeks submitting formal documentation through the proper channels. That's not disruptive conduct." "The characterization," Merritt said, "is at my discretion." She looked at him for a long moment. Not angry. She was past that, or she was containing it somewhere that wasn't her face. More like she was seeing something come into focus that had always been slightly blurry before. Not surprise. Recognition. "You're trying to make me withdraw the reports by threatening my position. I'm informing you of the consequences of your choices. And if I don't withdraw them?" Then this conversation becomes the start of a separation process. He said it gently, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it hard. "I'd rather it not be, but that's up to you." She picked up her badge from the table where she'd set it when she sat down, looked at it, put it back in her pocket. "Then I won't withdraw them," she said. What happened next was designed to be humiliating, and it mostly succeeded. Security was called, not because Claire resisted, but because Merritt wanted it witnessed. She understood that immediately. This wasn't about removing a problem quietly. This was a message, and the ER floor was the audience. She was told to collect her personal items from her locker and was walked there by a security guard named, according to his badge, T. Falks, who had the decency to look uncomfortable about the whole thing. She took her jacket, her water bottle, a photograph she kept taped to the back of her locker door that she didn't look at while she removed it, and nothing else. She left her clinical supplies because they belonged to the department. The walk back through the ER was 67 steps. She counted, not on purpose, just because her brain needed something to do. Priya was at the station. Their eyes met. Priya's face did something complicated and painful and ultimately stayed still. There were 3 other nurses visible, and 2 orderlies and a resident who had just come on shift and had no idea what he was walking into. A patient in Bay 3 had pulled back her curtain slightly to see what the footsteps were about. Merritt was waiting by the emergency entrance. "Your access will be suspended as of now," he said. He didn't raise his voice. Public humiliations in administrative settings are most effective when they're done calmly, she had learned. The calm is the message. This is nothing. You are nothing. "You're making a mistake," Claire said. Not angry, just factual. "Ms. Dawson, not about me." She looked at him steadily. "About the patients." "You're making a mistake about the patients." He smiled. It didn't reach anything above his chin. "We'll manage." "We'll see," she said. Falks held the door. She walked through it. And the air outside was cool and smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. She stood on the concrete outside the ambulance bay and looked at the parking lot for a moment without doing anything. Then she got her phone out of her jacket pocket and called her union rep, who didn't answer, and left a message that was more coherent than she would have expected given how she felt, which was something between hollow and furious, the 2 states occupying the same space in a way she didn't entirely have words for. She was still standing there, working through what to do next, when she heard it. Not helicopters yet. Something else first. A sound from the road. Not quite an explosion, more like the sharp, concussive report of a very large vehicle failing at speed, followed by what could only be described as impact. Multiple impacts. In sequence. She turned toward Hargrove Avenue. The smoke was visible before she could see the vehicle itself, black and thick, rising from somewhere 3 or 4 blocks east toward the freeway interchange. Her clinical brain had already started processing before the rest of her had fully decided what to do. Multiple vehicle incident, possible high-velocity crash, proximity to hospital advantageous for response, unknown number of casualties. She was already moving toward the ER entrance when the first ambulance radio transmission came through the lobby speakers. She could hear it faintly through the sliding glass, the dispatcher's voice sharp with controlled urgency. "Multiple units, requesting all available trauma. We've got a military transport involved, at least 4. The transmission cut out. She pushed through the doors. The ER had shifted in the 20 minutes she'd been outside. Not chaotically. Not yet. But the particular tension that precedes chaos, when people know something is coming and are trying to hold their normal positions for as long as possible. She saw it in how the nurses were moving, how the resident had his phone out and was reading something on the screen with a tight expression, how the charge nurse on duty, Marcus Webb, competent and calm under pressure, one of the people she trusted most in this building, was already reassigning positions with quiet efficiency. Then he saw her. "You're still here," he said. "What came through on the radio?" she asked. "Partial transmission. Military transport. Looks like a carrier vehicle, maybe 2. Came off the interchange at speed. Our dispatch is trying to reestablish contact." His jaw tightened. "We lost radio contact building-wide about 3 minutes ago. All frequencies. Communications is working on it. External lines? Functioning. Landlines are up. Cell is spotty." He paused. Merritt just put out an all-staff message saying to refer any incoming trauma to receiving protocol and that existing staff will manage. "How many trauma-capable attendings do you have on floor right now?" Marcus looked at her. 2. And one of them is post-call. She did the math. It wasn't good math. "Who's your highest acuity tech available?" "Dawson." He said her name like a warning. "You've been suspended." And you're about to have multiple trauma casualties from a military vehicle incident come through those doors with 2 attending physicians and a broken radio system. She kept her voice even. I'm asking who your best trauma tech is. He was quiet for a moment. Yolanda Reyes. She's good. How's her vascular? Solid. Not your level, but solid. Before she could respond, they both heard it. The sound from outside the building changing register. The distant thrum of the helicopter she'd heard earlier, which she'd filed away and not fully processed, was now suddenly not distant. It was directly overhead. More than one. And then a second sound underneath it, from street level. Engines, heavy ones, not ambulances. Marcus moved to the window first. She followed. Hargrove Avenue, which was a mid-sized 4-lane road that typically carried light morning traffic, was now occupied by 3 armored military vehicles. The heavy, block-square kind that don't belong in civilian contexts, moving in deliberate formation toward the hospital entrance. They weren't racing. They were steady, purposeful, which was somehow more alarming than speed would have been. What is that? Marcus said. Not a question. More like his brain processing something it hadn't expected to need to process. The first vehicle stopped 30 feet from the ambulance bay. Before it had fully settled, the rear doors were open and uniformed personnel were out. 8, 10, moving with the specific efficiency of people who've trained for exactly this scenario, whatever this scenario was. 2 of them were carrying someone on a stretcher. Others were establishing a perimeter. Then the second vehicle. 3 more stretchers. Claire had already turned away from the window. Get every available bed in Trauma Bay cleared. Bay 1, 2, and 3. Clear them now. Dawson? Marcus. She looked at him. You can call security on me after. Right now you have incoming. He held her gaze for 1 second. Then he turned to the floor and started directing. The first casualty through the doors was a large man in his mid-40s, in military dress that had been partially cut away, with the kind of face that had probably spent 30 years being impassive and was currently doing something close to human fear. His injuries were significant. She could see that from across the room, could read the specific grammar of trauma the way some people read text. Internal bleeding, almost certainly. Possible spinal involvement, 2 lacerations on the left arm that were less urgent than they looked. The military personnel who came with him were not in distress, but they were not calm either. They were controlled in a specific way that said we are holding it together because the situation requires it, which is different from actually fine. An officer, she read the insignia without quite meaning to, stepped to the center of the ER floor. Her voice was clear and clipped. This is Colonel Voss. He was in the primary vehicle at the time of impact. He requires immediate trauma intervention. Who is your senior trauma specialist? Dr. Fenn, the post-call attending, stepped forward. He was capable, but visibly exhausted and slightly unsure what jurisdiction protocol looked like in this situation. I'm attending physician on, is there a Claire Dawson on this staff? The question landed differently than most questions land. There was a beat of pure silence, not the absence of sound, but the specific silence that happens when a room full of people all stop at the same time. The officer was looking at Dr. Fenn. He was looking at the officer. Then, almost involuntarily, several sets of eyes drifted toward the window where Marcus and Claire had been standing, which now contained only Marcus. Claire stepped out from the supply corridor where she'd been pulling equipment. I'm Claire Dawson, she said. The officer looked at her, then at her clothes, not scrubs, because she'd been suspended, still in her street clothes from when she'd walked out, then back at her face. Something in the officer's expression did something quick and complicated. Captain Reyes, Army Special Operations Medical Command. She extended her hand. Claire shook it. We have 4 critical casualties from the transport incident. Colonel Voss is the priority. We were told this hospital is your current placement. It was, Claire said. Ma'am? I was suspended from clinical duties approximately 45 minutes ago. She said it without emphasis. Just information. Administrative matter. Captain Reyes processed this. By whom? Hospital Director Harlan Merritt. Reyes turned to the nearest uniformed person behind her and said something Claire couldn't catch. Then she turned back. The Army has federal jurisdiction over the medical treatment of active duty personnel in emergency circumstances. That supersedes local institutional authority. She paused. We're requesting your involvement in Colonel Voss's care. Will you assist? From somewhere behind her, through the glass of the administrative corridor, Claire could see Merritt. He'd come down when the vehicles arrived. Of course he had. He was standing very still, watching. His face had gone through several things in the last 60 seconds and hadn't landed on any of them. Claire looked at Reyes. Tell me what you know about the mechanism of injury. Transport vehicle went off the interchange at highway speed. Front vehicle took the primary impact. Voss was in the command position, third row, airbag deployment, significant deceleration trauma. He was responsive at the scene, lost consciousness in transit. How long ago? 22 minutes. She was already moving toward Bay 1. I need imaging priority, blood type on file if you have it, and someone needs to get me a pair of gloves and a gown before I touch anything. She looked at Yolanda Reyes, the tech Marcus had mentioned, who was already positioned at the bay entrance. Yolanda, walk with me. Yolanda said, You got it, and fell into step beside her. And just like that, Claire was back in the only world where she'd ever really made complete sense. Not paperwork, not politics, not the grinding machinery of institutional self-protection. The clear, immediate, solvable problem of a person who was hurt and needed not to be. Behind her, she heard Merritt's voice in the corridor. Someone tell me what's happening. Why is she... She didn't hear the rest because Bay 1's curtain closed and the work started and the world outside it stopped mattering for a while. Colonel Voss was a man who looked like he was built to last and was currently losing that argument. She worked fast and she worked specifically, calling instruments and readings and differentials in the flat, exact language of a mind that had stopped performing and was simply operating. Yolanda was good. Marcus had been right about that. And the ER nurses who rotated through over the next 40 minutes met her requests without hesitation, as though the fact of her being here was settled, and not something any of them had the bandwidth to question. The imaging came back with 2 things she'd suspected, and 1 she hadn't. The one she hadn't was a slow bleed behind the left kidney, subtle enough that it would have been easy to miss at first read, and dangerous enough that missing it would have mattered in about another hour. There, she said, putting her gloved finger to the screen. Not for drama, just to mark it so Yolanda and the radiology tech could both orient to what she was seeing. That's the priority. Everything else is secondary to that. Interventional, Yolanda said. Not yet. I want to manage this conservatively first and see how he responds. Get me a pressure reading in 5 minutes. She paused. And someone find out whether we have a vascular surgeon in the building or if we need to call one in. Dr. Renata Hollis is on call, one of the nurses said. She's not on floor, but she can be here in 20 minutes. Get her in. Claire stepped back from the imaging screen. How are the other 3? One is stable, Yolanda said, checking a tablet. One is in Bay 2 with Dr. Fenn. One, she paused. One is asking for you. Claire looked up. Not for medical reasons. Captain Reyes wants 5 minutes when you have them. Tell her 10. She spent those 10 minutes with Voss, watching numbers, making adjustments, talking to the attending and the nurses in the specific shorthand that develops when people have been working under pressure long enough. Then she stepped out. Reyes was waiting in the corridor, away from the main foot traffic. She had a phone in her hand and an expression that was less controlled than it had been 40 minutes ago. Colonel Voss, Claire said. He's stable for now. We have a vascular surgeon en route. The bleed is slow, but it needs to be watched closely. I'd say he's got a good outlook if the next 2 hours go well. Reyes nodded. I need you to understand something about what's about to happen, she said. Claire waited. When our unit made contact with Stonegate Medical Center this morning to coordinate emergency response, we ran standard personnel verification on available staff. Your name came up. Reyes looked at her directly. We know your full record, Ms. Dawson. Not your civilian file, your full record. Something went quiet in Claire's chest. That record is not what's in your employee file here, Reyes said. I'm guessing that was deliberate. It was, Claire said. I left that chapter behind. 14 years, Reyes said. Combat trauma specialist. 3 deployments. Decorated twice. You ran a field hospital under active fire conditions for 11 days in circumstances that, she paused as if editing herself, that most people aren't aware are possible. She looked at the badge, or the space where Claire's badge would have been if she hadn't had it revoked. What you did in Bay 1 this morning is consistent with that, which is why what Director Merritt did this morning is not going to stand. From down the corridor, past the hub of the ER, through the glass-paneled administrative wing, Claire could see Merritt in what appeared to be a heated conversation with 2 people in military uniform. One of them had a folder. The other had a phone, and the phone appeared to be ringing, and Merritt appeared to be very interested in not making eye contact with anyone in his immediate vicinity. There are investigators on site, Reyes said. They were already being dispatched before this morning's incident. There were concerns related to federal medical contracting this hospital holds. What happened to you today is going to be part of what they look at. Claire kept her eyes on the corridor. How long before someone with authority over Merritt is in this building? About 15 minutes ago, Reyes said quietly. Claire looked at her. The lead investigator came in with our second vehicle. A pause. She's been in the administrative wing for the last half hour. We didn't want to say anything until Voss was stabilized. Through the glass panel, Merritt's posture changed. He'd been standing with the particular confidence of a man who runs a building and knows it. Now his shoulders had done something else, a compression, slight but readable, and his eyes had found something on a document that the uniformed woman in front of him was showing him, and whatever was on that document had taken the confidence somewhere it couldn't easily return from. Claire Dawson watched him read it. She was very still. She was thinking about 6 weeks of reports that no one had answered, about the patient in Bay 4 with the cardiac flag she'd filed that morning before any of this started, about the 14-year-old boy whose consult had been misrouted for 6 hours, about the overnight shift that ran on skeleton crew between 2 and 5 a.m. when the people who set these policies were home and sleeping. She was thinking about the photograph she'd taken from her locker before she left, not looking at it when she did it, just knowing it was there, just knowing it needed to come with her. Merritt looked up from the document. His eyes traveled across the ER floor and found her. The distance between them was maybe 60 feet of linoleum and glass. He looked at her. She looked back. His expression was doing something she recognized, the very early, very private moment when a man realizes that the outcome he planned for is not the one he's getting. And she didn't feel triumphant about it, exactly, or at least not only that. She felt, more than anything, like something that had been held at the wrong angle was finally being set down correctly. Behind her, Yolanda's voice came from Bay 1. Dawson, Voss's pressure is dropping. She turned. She moved. She moved the way she moved when everything else fell away. Not fast in the showy sense, not the kind of fast that looks impressive from the outside, but the efficient, zero-waste fast of someone who has learned that extra motion costs time and time costs lives. Bay 1's curtain was still swinging behind her when her hands were already reading Voss's vitals from the monitor, her eyes doing the scan that her brain processes before she's consciously aware it's happening. The number on the pressure display was wrong, not catastrophically wrong yet, but trending in a direction that had a clear destination if she didn't change it. How long since the last reading? She asked. 4 minutes, Yolanda said. He was holding at 110/70. That's a 20-point drop. The kidney bleed's accelerating. She was already at the supply cart. I need a second line in, wide open, and I need Dr. Hollis on the phone right now, not when she gets here. Now, while she's driving. She's 12 minutes out. Then she has 12 minutes to hear what I'm seeing before she walks in. Claire looked up at the monitor, then back at Voss's face. He was unconscious, but his color was doing something she didn't like. And get me ultrasound at bedside. I want to watch that bleed in real time. Yolanda moved. The nurses moved. The room reorganized around the problem the way a good trauma team does. Not because anyone was performing competence, but because the competence was just there, activated, doing its job. Hollis picked up on the second ring. Her voice was slightly breathless. Driving fast, probably. Tell me, she said, without preamble. Claire told her. She described the imaging, the bleed location, the pressure trajectory, the mechanism of injury, and what she'd done in the last 40 minutes in a tight, precise sequence that took under 2 minutes. Hollis asked 3 questions. Sharp, specific questions that told Claire she was dealing with someone who actually knew her field. "You're thinking conservative management isn't going to hold," Hollis said. It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking if this is still dropping in the next 8 minutes, we're talking intervention. I can be set up in OR2 in 15 minutes of walking through the door. Tell them to have it ready." "Already requested," Claire said, which wasn't entirely true. She looked at Yolanda as she said it, and Yolanda immediately got on the phone for OR2. She stayed at Voss's side and watched the numbers and talked to Hollis and made adjustments and did not think about Merritt or the corridor or the investigator in the administrative wing or any of it. The bay was a contained world, and it had exactly one problem, and she was working on it. 8 minutes later, the pressure stabilized. Not improved, stabilized, which was not the same thing, but was enough to keep intervention in the contingency column rather than the immediate column. She let out a breath she hadn't been tracking. "Holding," Yolanda said quietly. "For now." Claire stepped back from the bedside. "Do not take your eyes off that monitor. If it drops another 5 points, I want to know before the number changes." She stepped out of the bay. The ER floor had transformed while she'd been in with Voss. That was the word. Transformed, not descended into chaos, which was what she might have expected given the morning's events. Instead, something organized had moved in. The military personnel who had arrived with the convoy had integrated into the space with a specific, practiced calm, not interfering with clinical operations, but establishing a physical presence that had, apparently, a profound effect on the usual social dynamics of the department. Merritt was not visible. That was new. Marcus Webb materialized at her elbow. "Hollis is pulling into the lot," he said. "OR2 is prepped." A pause. "Voss's guys are asking for an update. Tell them he's stable for the moment and there's a vascular surgeon 2 minutes from the door." She looked around the floor. "The other 3? "One fully stable, monitoring in Bay 4. One in Bay 2 with Fenn. Left arm fracture and a significant concussion, non-critical. The third one," he paused, "is complicated." She looked at him. "Spinal," he said. "Possible C5 compression. Fenn's managing, but he's been asking for you twice in the last 15 minutes. Why didn't anyone come get me?" Marcus gave her a look that communicated several things at once, without being rude about any of them. She understood it immediately. Coming to get her required acknowledging that she was the right person to ask, which required navigating everything that Merritt had set up this morning, and most people in institutional settings will choose being paralyzed over making a call that contradicts the organizational hierarchy, even when the organizational hierarchy is obviously wrong. She had seen this her entire career. It never stopped being frustrating. "I'm going," she said. Bay 2 had the energy of a room where 2 different skill levels were trying to work on the same problem. Fenn was good. She wanted to be fair about that. He was not incompetent. But he was post-call and uncertain, which in spinal cases is a particular kind of dangerous, because uncertainty in those cases tends to express itself as excessive intervention. Too many hands, too many tests ordered simultaneously, decisions being made in parallel instead of sequence. The patient's name, she learned, was Sergeant First Class Doyle. He was 37, built like someone who made a habit of carrying heavy things over long distances, and he was awake, which was both good and complicated. "My feet," he said when she stepped to the bedside. His voice was controlled, deliberate, the voice of someone who was choosing not to panic because panic was not an option they'd allowed themselves. "I can feel my feet. Does that mean... It means we're going to find out exactly what we're dealing with before anyone tells you anything definitive," she said. "What I can tell you right now is that you're awake, you're talking, and you felt your feet. Those are all things we want." She looked at the imaging on the screen behind Fenn's shoulder. "Did you lose sensation at any point after impact?" "Maybe. I don't know. It was..." He stopped. "There was a lot happening." "That's a reasonable answer." She looked at Fenn, quietly, moving slightly so Doyle couldn't read her expression. "What's your read on the compression?" Possible disc involvement at C5 to C6, Fenn said, equally quiet. I don't think it's cord damage, but I'd want neurosurgery. Get Patel on the phone. Doctor. Anika Patel was the attending neurosurgeon, and Claire knew she was covering today because she'd read the board this morning before everything went sideways. Tell her what you told me. She can do a remote consult while she's finishing whatever she's finishing. She's in a procedure. Then get her when she's out. How long? 20 minutes, maybe. Then we wait 20 minutes. Immobilize, monitor. No unnecessary movement. Nothing changes until Patel has eyes on this imaging. She looked back at Doyle. You understand what we're doing? You're being careful, Doyle said. Aggressively careful, she said. He almost smiled. That's an army thing. I know, she said. She hadn't meant to say it like that, with the weight it carried. Doyle noticed. His eyes did something that she didn't address, and he didn't ask about, and she moved back to the imaging screen with Fenn. Bob. Hollis arrived in the way good surgeons arrive in a crisis, without theatrics, already in motion. She was in her mid-50s, short, with the kind of efficient haircut that said, I make decisions quickly, and she'd apparently gotten enough from the phone call that she walked directly to Bay 1, reviewed the current numbers, asked Claire 2 follow-up questions, and made a call. We're going to the OR, Hollis said. I don't want to wait for this to deteriorate. I'd rather operate on a stable patient than a crashing one. Agreed, Claire said. Are you scrubbing in? The question was asked without subtext, but it had a context that both of them were aware of. Claire was not technically on active clinical staff. Her suspension had not been reversed by anything official. What had happened with Reyes and the Army's jurisdictional claim was real, but had not produced paperwork, which in a hospital is sometimes the only form reality takes. That's up to administration, Claire said. Hollis looked at her with the particular expression of a physician who has had approximately enough of administrative considerations for one day. I'm asking the surgeon question, not the administration question. Do you want to scrub in? Yes. Then scrub in. Hollis turned back to the cart. I'll deal with the paperwork when this man isn't bleeding. Or2 was cool and lit and smelled of nothing except what operating rooms smell of, which is its own specific nothing that Claire's body recognized before her brain had finished the thought. She'd spent more hours in spaces like this one than she could reasonably estimate. Not just civilian ORs, but military surgical units, field setups, once a converted shipping container in conditions she did not think about in linear fashion anymore. The muscle memory was there regardless of where she put herself for the last several years. It didn't atrophy. She was gloved and positioned opposite Hollis, and they worked. The bleed was where the imaging had said it was, behaving roughly as predicted, with one complication they hadn't anticipated, a small secondary vessel involvement that required an additional 20 minutes to address. Hollis narrated in the flat, continuous tone of a surgeon who thinks out loud not for the benefit of the room, but because the sound of her own voice helps her process. Claire responded when responded to and offered twice on her own initiative, both times correctly, both times in a way that made Hollis pause briefly without breaking motion. You've done vascular work, Hollis said at one point. Not a question. Some, Claire said. More than some. She didn't answer. They kept working. 91 minutes from the first incision, Hollis called it. The vessel was repaired. The bleed was controlled. Voss's pressure, which had been watched by the anesthesiologist with the intensity of someone diffusing something, stabilized and began to improve. Closing, Hollis said, and the room shifted into the next register. Claire stepped back when her role in the closing was complete and stood for a moment in the corner of the OR with her hands at her sides, and something moved through her that was not quite relief and not quite anything else she had a clean word for. It was the specific sensation of a thing that was worth doing having been done. She felt it every time, still, after everything. She didn't think she would ever stop feeling it. She was ungowning in the scrub corridor when Captain Reyes found her. He's going to make it, Claire said before Reyes could ask. Reyes closed her eyes for a single second. Good, she said. Then, I need you to come with me. Michel. The administrative wing of Stonegate Medical Center had a different texture than the clinical floors. Carpet instead of linoleum, slightly lower lighting, the particular quiet of spaces that exist to manage the appearance of things rather than things themselves. Claire had been up here maybe a dozen times in 23 years. It was not her world. Today, it looked different. The carpet was the same and the lighting was the same, but there were 3 people in the corridor who were clearly federal, and one of them was on a phone speaking in a voice too low to hear, and through the glass panel of the main conference room, Claire could see documents spread across the table, and 2 laptop screens open, and a woman standing at the head of the table with the posture of someone who owns every room she walks into. Reyes knocked on the glass. The woman looked up. Her name, Claire learned in the next 30 seconds, was Special Agent Dana Forsyth, and she worked for the Office of Inspector General, and she had been investigating Stonegate Medical Center for 11 weeks before this morning had accelerated the timeline of several things simultaneously. "Ms. Dawson," she said. "Sit down." Claire sat. "We pulled your full personnel file this morning. Both of them." Forsyth set a folder on the table. The civilian file Stonegate holds, and the military record that exists in a different system that most civilian employers don't know to look for. She paused. "Your military record includes commendations that your director, had he known about them, would have been legally and professionally untenable in his position to dismiss." "He didn't know," Claire said. "I didn't tell him. I didn't tell anyone here." "Why?" She considered how to answer that. "I left that part of my life in a specific place. I didn't bring it with me when I came to Stonegate." She paused. "And I didn't want to be hired for what I used to be. I wanted the work to stand on its own." Forsyth looked at her for a moment. "The reports you filed over the last 6 weeks, none of which were acted on." "No, but they were read." Forsyth opened the folder and turned it so Claire could see the first page. "By us. Your reports were forwarded to our office by a staff member here who didn't feel safe submitting to the OIG directly. We've been cross-referencing what you documented against the billing records, the staffing logs, and the medication dispensing data for the last 11 months. She turned another page. The irregularities you identified are consistent with a pattern of deliberate fraud, specifically Medicare billing manipulation and falsified acuity reports that were being used to justify staffing reductions that then enabled the fraud to continue. Claire looked at the page. Then she looked up. "How long has this been happening?" "As near as we can establish, the core scheme began approximately 3 years ago, before Merritt, actually, though he expanded it significantly after he arrived." Forsyth paused. "The person who set it up is still on staff. Senior financial officer, name of Brendan Quillen." She knew the name. She'd seen it on 3 different forms in the last 6 weeks, and not thought anything specific about it. "Your reports," Forsyth continued, "were being intercepted before they reached the channels that would have triggered an automatic review. Someone in administration was flagging them and pulling them offline. When you refused to withdraw them this morning, Merritt moved to remove you before the reports could be resubmitted through a different channel." She closed the folder. "What he didn't know was that by this point, we already had copies of everything you'd filed." Claire sat with that for a moment. "The investigator who was forwarding your reports to us," she said slowly. "Who was it?" Forsyth's expression shifted slightly. Not closed, more like a door that was slightly ajar and choosing not to open further. "I'm not in a position to say that right now." Claire nodded. She had a suspicion, and it was a suspicion that would have to wait. "Where's Merritt now?" she asked. "Downstairs. He's been asked not to leave the building." Forsyth picked up her phone. "We're not at the point of formal action yet. We need to complete document verification before we—" She stopped. Because something had happened to the phone in her hand, a message from the look of it, that made her face do something quickly controlled. She stood up. "Stay here," she said to Claire, and her voice had changed register. She left the room. Through the glass panel, Claire watched her move toward the corridor, toward the person who was still on their phone, who was now holding it out toward Forsyth with an expression that telegraphed something urgent. Claire couldn't hear anything, but she watched Forsyth read whatever was on that screen, and she watched Forsyth's jaw tighten, and she watched Forsyth look up and look directly toward the stairwell that led to the clinical floor. And then Forsyth was moving, fast. Claire was out of the chair before the door had finished swinging. In the stairwell, taking the steps at a pace that was not quite running, Forsyth said over her shoulder, "The secure server our team set up in the facility 30 minutes ago just registered an unauthorized access attempt. Someone tried to remote delete a file archive." "What archive?" "Surveillance records. Internal CCTV footage. 11 months of it." Forsyth pushed through the door to the lower corridor. "The attempt failed. Our tech had it mirrored off-site, but it came from a workstation in the billing department. Third floor." Third floor. Billing. Quillen. They came around the corner of the third-floor corridor, and the billing department's glass door was visible from 40 feet away. The lights were on. The office appeared occupied. And standing just outside the door with his phone in his hand and an expression she had never seen on his face before was Harlan Merritt. He saw them at the same moment they saw him. He looked at Forsyth. He looked at Claire. Something moved across his face that was not quite anything he would have allowed himself in a public setting under normal circumstances. It was too raw, too unguarded, the face of someone who has just understood that the version of this morning he'd been managing toward has ceased to exist. Then his phone rang. He looked at it. He looked at them. He answered it anyway, which was perhaps the most human thing he'd done all day. The reflex of a man reaching for the device that has always been his mechanism for being in control of things. The voice on the other end was audible from where Claire was standing, even in the corridor. She couldn't make out words, but she could hear the tone, and she could see it land on Merritt's face like something physical. He lowered the phone slowly. "That was my attorney," he said. To neither of them in particular. To the corridor. Forsyth stopped in front of him. "Mr. Merritt, I need you to step away from this door." He didn't move. Not in defiance, more like he'd temporarily lost the signal that told him how to operate his body in the normal way. "The footage," he said. Not to Forsyth. To Claire. Like she was the one he needed to address. "You don't know what—" He stopped. Started again. "There are things in those records that you are taking out of context. That's what review processes are for," Claire said. "You don't understand what this place was when I arrived. The debt structure, the contracts—" "Mr. Merritt," Forsyth said, sharper now. "I was cleaning up someone else's—" "Sir." Forsyth's hand was on her radio. "Step away from the door. I won't ask again." He stepped back. His phone was still in his hand. His attorney was probably still on the line. He looked in that moment exactly like what he was. A man who had run a building for 4 years on the assumption that the gap between what he was doing and what could be proven would never close, and who was standing at the precise moment of understanding that it had. Behind the glass door of the billing department, there was movement. Forsyth's radio crackled. She lifted it and listened, and then she looked at Claire, and what was in her eyes was something between urgency and a kind of grim confirmation. "There's someone in that office still at a terminal," she said, "and the system is showing a second deletion attempt in progress." She pushed through the door. Claire followed, 2 steps behind, and what she saw when she came through was Brendan Quillen, mid-50s, unremarkable face, the kind of man who'd spent a career being the person who handled the numbers that nobody asked questions about. Sitting at his workstation, with his hands moving on the keyboard with the specific concentrated urgency of someone who knows they have a limited amount of time to do an irreversible thing. He heard them come in, and his hands moved faster. Forsyth was across the room in 4 steps, and then, in the stillness that followed, with Quillen's hands off the keyboard and Forsyth's hand on his shoulder, and Merritt visible through the glass of the door behind them, in that specific, held moment, Claire heard something none of them expected. From downstairs. From the ER floor. Her name, called in Yolanda's voice, in a register that Claire recognized without needing to analyze. Something had changed with Doyle. She was already moving when Yolanda called her name a second time. The stairwell was faster than the elevator, and she took it without deciding to, her hand on the railing, feet finding each step without her eyes on them, the way her body defaults to automatic when her brain is already somewhere ahead of her. Behind her, she heard Forsyth say something sharp to the agent in the corridor, something about securing the terminal and not letting Quillen touch anything, and then the stairwell door closed and Claire was alone with the sound of her own footsteps and the specific dread of not knowing yet what she was running toward. She knew Doyle's case the way she knew all of them. Not from a file, but from the physical reality of the man in that bay. The imaging she'd read, the way he'd said, "I can feel my feet," with the particular care of someone for whom that information was everything. Spinal cases don't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes the thing that's wrong moves quietly, incrementally, until the window closes. She pushed through the ground floor door. Yolanda was outside Bay 2, and her face had the expression Claire recognized as bad, but not yet irreversible, which was something. "What happened?" Claire said. "Sensation loss. Started about 8 minutes ago. He said his feet went first, then his calves. It came on fast." Yolanda was walking with her toward the bay. "Patel's still in her procedure. They're trying to pull her out. Fenn ordered imaging, but Doyle won't let them move him. Yes, still. He's asking for you." "What do you mean he won't let them move him?" "I mean he told Fenn to stop touching him and asked for you by name, and then stopped talking." She came through the curtain. Doyle was exactly where she'd left him, which was correct. Immobilized, positioned, as he should be. His face had changed. He was doing the thing that combat-trained people do when they're scared, which is to make their face stop doing things. It was a discipline, not a calm. She could see the effort it cost him. "Still there?" she said, meaning the sensation. "Fading," he said. "Left side faster than right." That asymmetry was information. She filed it. "When did it start?" "Maybe 20 minutes after you went upstairs. I didn't say anything for a few minutes because I thought—" He stopped. His jaw was tight. "I thought it was going to reverse." She didn't tell him that waiting had been a mistake because that information was not useful to him right now. Instead, she said, "I'm going to do a quick assessment. Tell me exactly what you feel as I go." She worked through it methodically. Not quickly, because quick in a spinal assessment is how you miss things, but without hesitation, each step clear and sequential. Light touch test, proprioception, deep tendon reflexes. She talked to him through all of it in a voice that was matter-of-fact because matter-of-fact is what his nervous system needed right now, not reassurance, which he would have read as a signal that things were worse than she was saying. The picture that emerged was specific and concerning. The compression at C5 to C6 that the earlier imaging had flagged as possible had clearly progressed. The asymmetric presentation suggested cord involvement that wasn't diffuse. It had a location, a directionality, which meant it also potentially had an intervention window. Potentially. "I need current imaging," she said to Yolanda. "Not the earlier scans, but I need new ones. And I need Patel out of that procedure in the next 5 minutes. They're working on it. Work faster." She looked back at Doyle. "Here's what I know. Something has changed at the injury site. I don't know the full picture yet because I don't have current images. What I'm not going to do is move you or intervene without that information because if I'm wrong about what I'm seeing, any intervention I make now could make this worse. Do you understand that?" He looked at her. "You're telling me I might have to wait." "I'm telling you I need 4 minutes of information before I act." "Yes." He breathed through his nose. "Okay. If you feel anything change, any change at all, you say so immediately. Don't decide whether it's significant first, just say it." "Understood." She stepped back from the bay and found Marcus at her elbow. "Imaging is being set up now," he said quietly, "but there's a problem." "What?" "The portable MRI unit. It's been down since Tuesday." His voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering bad news they don't want to be responsible for. "Maintenance was supposed to come Thursday and didn't. The imaging request for Doyle is going to require transport to radiology, which means moving him." "We can't move him without knowing what we're moving." "I know." She stood very still for a moment. The ER around her was operating at a level of controlled intensity that had its own sound. The particular frequency of a department pushed to capacity, not failing but not comfortable. The military personnel were still present, a visible thread of external authority running through the space that was both stabilizing and surreal. Voss was upstairs in post-op. 3 other soldiers at various stages of treatment. Doyle in Bay 2 losing sensation in his lower body in a way that the broken portable imaging unit had just made significantly more dangerous to address. Can we transport him to radiology in a way that keeps his spine protected? Maybe, if Patel consults first. Get me Patel. Dr. Anika Patel came on the phone from outside the OR. Her procedure had ended 6 minutes ahead of schedule, which was the first thing that had gone accidentally right in the last hour. She was direct, asked the questions that needed asking, and listened without interrupting while Claire described the progression. Asymmetric and unilateral, Patel said, half to herself. That's actually somewhat useful information. That's what I thought. It suggests the cord isn't diffusely compromised. If it's a focal compression event, the window for intervention is real, but it's not infinite. A pause. I need imaging. I can't make a surgical decision without imaging. I'm aware our portable unit is down. Then we transport. I can be in radiology in 8 minutes. We set up there. I review the scan as it comes off the machine, and we make the call in that room. Another pause. Can you manage the transport? Yes. What's your gut on cord involvement? She had learned across a long career not to dismiss the question when someone she respected asked it. Significant enough that I don't want to wait longer than we have to, but not so far progressed that I think the window is already closed. Okay? Patel's voice had shifted into decision mode. I'm coming in. Get him ready to move. Us. The transport of a patient with potential spinal cord injury in a compromised state through a hospital corridor is not a graceful process. It requires positioning, equipment, a team that communicates in real time, and the ability to manage every variable while moving: heart rate, blood pressure, oxygenation, neurological status. Claire ran it herself, with Yolanda on one side and a nurse named Terrence on the other, and they moved Doyle through the ER and into the radiology corridor with the specific, non-theatrical efficiency that is the only acceptable mode. Doyle was quiet through all of it, not unconscious, awake, tracking, doing the thing he'd been doing since she met him this morning, which was refusing to give the situation more than it needed from him. She found this, in a way she didn't articulate, deeply respectable. "You with me?" she asked once, in the corridor. "Still here," he said. Patel was in radiology when they arrived. Small, mid-40s, with the kind of focused stillness that some surgeons develop as a professional habit, and some are born with. She looked at Claire with the expression of two people who have communicated over the phone and are now calibrating whether the physical reality matches what the voice conveyed. Whatever she found in Claire's face appeared to satisfy her. "Let's see what we have," she said. The scan took 11 minutes. Claire stood in the observation area and watched the images build on the screen in sequence, and she saw what she'd suspected. And what she saw was not good, but it was also not the worst version of what it could have been. Patel was beside her. "There," she said, pointing. "Focal, C5 level, posterolateral. It's not diffuse compression. There's a specific structure causing this." She leaned closer. "That's bone fragment from the initial impact. It shifted. It wasn't visible on the first scan. No, it wouldn't have been. It was at the margin. When he was moved for transport to the hospital, or possibly with positional changes afterward, it migrated." She straightened. "That's actually manageable. That's a surgical problem with a surgical solution, not a systemic cord injury." A pause that was brief and weighted. "If we go in now, what's the risk?" "Standard surgical risk plus the complicating factor of his overall trauma state. He's not optimal for anesthesia. But if we wait—" She didn't finish the sentence because neither of them needed her to. "Does he know?" Claire asked. "Not yet. He needs to, before we do anything." Patel nodded. They went back into the room. She had seen people receive difficult medical information in a lot of different ways across a lot of different years. People wept. People went silent. People argued, or denied, or asked the same question 6 different ways, or made jokes that weren't really jokes. Doyle listened to Patel explain the finding with his eyes on the middle distance, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "What are the odds if you operate now versus if you don't?" Patel told him. She didn't soften it. "And if the surgery doesn't go perfectly," he asked, "then we've still removed the structural threat. What happens to existing function post-surgery depends on factors we won't know until we're in there." He was quiet again, then, "Do it. We need consent forms. Tell me where to sign." Well, while Patel took Doyle to prep, Claire came back to the ER floor and found that the landscape had changed again while she'd been in radiology. The change was not in the clinical space that was holding, managed the military casualties at various stable or improving states. The change was in the administrative layer, which had become visible in a new way. There were 2 additional federal vehicles in the lot. She saw them through the ambulance bay window. Unmarked sedans, parked at angles that suggested they'd arrived quickly and their occupants hadn't prioritized aesthetics. And the stairwell door that led to the administrative floor had 2 people stationed outside it who hadn't been there an hour ago. Marcus came to her with the expression of a man who has been collecting information all morning and is now holding more of it than feels comfortable. "What?" she said. "They arrested Quillen." She stopped. "About 20 minutes ago. Forsyth's people walked him out through the main entrance." He paused. "In front of about 15 staff members who were on break in the atrium." She thought about Quillen's hands on the keyboard. The deletion attempt. 11 months of surveillance footage that he'd tried to make disappear in the 60 seconds between understanding what was happening and being stopped from doing it. "What about Merritt?" "Still in the building. They took his phone. He's in the conference room on 3 with 2 agents and his attorney who came in about 40 minutes ago." Marcus hesitated. "There's something else." "Tell me." "The nurses on the overnight shift, Priya, and 2 others from the regular ER team. They've been meeting with Forsyth's investigators for the last hour, voluntarily." He looked at her carefully. Priya apparently had documentation, personal records she'd been keeping for 8 months. Timestamps, incidents, patient outcomes, things she'd seen and written down because she didn't know what else to do with them. Claire stood with that for a moment. 8 months. Priya, who had said Merritt's been in since 8 that morning with such careful neutrality, who had not looked up from the handoff notes when Claire was walked out, who had stayed still because the situation required stillness, and who had, quietly, for 8 months, been building the record that the system should have been building and hadn't. "She's the one who forwarded my reports," Claire said. Marcus didn't confirm or deny it. He didn't have to. She felt something move through her that was not sentiment. She didn't have time for sentiment right now, but was adjacent to it. The particular quality of understanding that you were not, in fact, as alone in something as it felt while you were doing it. "Is she okay?" Claire asked. "She's nervous, but okay." He paused. "She asked if you know." "Tell her yes." He nodded and moved away, and Claire turned back to the work because the work was what there was. Doyle's surgery began at 1:14 p.m. Patel led it. Claire was not in the room. Patel had her own team and didn't need her, and Claire had a floor to manage and 4 other patients in various states of recovery that still required attention. She checked on Voss in post-op, who was conscious and communicating in short, effortful sentences, and whose color had improved to something approaching human. She reviewed the concussion case in Bay 2. The soldier whose name was Specialist Harker, 26 years old, who had been stable for 3 hours and was asking repeatedly when he could call his wife. She got him a phone. She was reviewing Harker's monitoring data when Captain Reyes found her. Reyes had been in and out of the clinical floor all morning, coordinating, communicating, managing the interface between the military presence and the hospital staff with a competence that Claire had noted and not commented on. Now she came to the bay entrance and waited, which Claire noticed, and when Claire looked up, she stepped in. "Forsyth wants you upstairs when you have a clear moment," Reyes said. "How clear does the moment need to be?" She said, "When you can." "Not an emergency." Reyes paused. "She has the surveillance footage. She's been reviewing it with her team for the last 2 hours." Claire looked at Harker's chart. He was stable. 20 minutes, she said. "I need to check on Voss first." Reyes nodded. Then she said, with a slight shift in her voice that indicated this was a different kind of statement, "Colonel Voss asked about you this morning, before the surgery. He wanted to know who you were." Claire looked at her. "I told him your military record," Reyes said. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Get her back." She paused. He didn't mean just for the medical care. Claire didn't respond to that. Not because she didn't have a response, but because the hallway outside the bay had just gone briefly quiet in a way that was different from normal quiet. A held breath quality, the kind that precedes something. Then someone said Forsyth's name in the corridor, loudly, and someone else said the third floor, and then there were footsteps moving fast. She was out of the bay before she'd made the decision to move. The elevator was occupied. She took the stairs again, and this time Reyes was with her. And by the time they came out on the third floor, they could see that the conference room at the end of the administrative corridor was the focal point. The agents who'd been stationed outside it were at the door, one of them speaking into a radio, and Forsyth was there, and the glass panel showed the room inside. Merritt was standing. He'd been sitting for hours, apparently, in that room with his attorney, and now he was standing, and his attorney was beside him with a hand on his arm that Merritt was not acknowledging. And on the table between Merritt and the two agents facing him was a laptop showing, even from 40 feet away through the glass panel, Claire could see it. Security footage. Timestamp visible in the corner. She knew what timestamp that would be. She'd been in this building long enough to know where the cameras were. Forsyth turned when she heard the stairwell door, saw Claire and Reyes. She nodded once, a small pointed nod that communicated something specific, and then turned back. Claire came down the corridor. Through the glass, she could see Merritt's face more clearly now. He was looking at the laptop screen, and his expression had moved beyond the controlled distress of earlier, beyond the man who was managing his response to a situation he still believed he might partially navigate out of. He was looking at the screen with the face of someone who is seeing, in full and specific detail, the distance between what they believed could be proven and what actually could be proven. It was a particular expression. She had seen it before, in a different context, in a different life, the moment when the gap closes. His attorney said something close to his ear. He didn't move. One of the agents reached forward and pressed a key, and the footage advanced. Forsyth came to stand beside Claire. 11 months, she said very quietly. He knew about the billing fraud from the first month. There's footage of the meeting where Quillen walked him through the mechanics. She kept her voice below carrying distance. There's also footage of a meeting 4 weeks ago where Merritt specifically directed the interception of internal reports. She paused. Your reports, among others. Claire watched him through the glass. He was very still now. His attorney was still talking. He wasn't listening. He was trying to suppress a federal whistleblower, Forsyth said. Is that what I am? That's what the law calls you. A brief pause. What we call you is a witness. And right now you're the cleanest witness we have because you documented everything in real time and tried to route it through proper channels and were blocked. She looked at Claire directly. When this goes to prosecution, your reports and your testimony are the structural spine of the case. Everything else we have builds on what you filed. In the conference room, Merritt's attorney said something that was clearly a recommendation. Merritt finally turned from the screen. He looked at the two agents. He looked at his attorney. And then, as though some organizing structure had simply gone out of him, he sat down. His attorney leaned in again. After a moment, Merritt nodded. One of the agents stepped out of the conference room. He was carrying a folder, and he spoke to Forsyth briefly. Forsyth's expression was professional and unreadable, but her posture changed slightly. The particular shift of someone who has been waiting for a specific confirmation and has now received it. He's cooperating, she said. Claire absorbed that. On Quillen? And on 2 other administrative staff. There's a wider structure here than we initially mapped. Forsyth moved back toward the conference room. I'll need a formal statement from you before end of day. Everything you witnessed, everything you filed, the interaction this morning. I'll give you whatever you need. Forsyth nodded and went back in. Claire stood in the corridor alone for a moment. The administrative floor was quiet in its particular way. The carpet under her feet was the same carpet it had always been. The overhead lights hadn't changed, but the building felt differently weighted, like something structural had shifted inside it without anyone changing the walls. Her phone buzzed. Yolanda. Patel says the fragment is out. Doyle's responding. Ask her for update when you can. She read it twice. Then she put the phone in her pocket and stood another moment in the administrative corridor of Stonegate Medical Center, which was a building she'd worked in for 23 years and been removed from 9 hours ago and had never fully left. And she let herself feel what was true, which was complicated and not reducible to any single clean emotion and was, in that way, appropriate to the situation. Then Marcus's voice came over the radio, clipped to a passing nurse's scrub pocket. carrying into the corridor with the particular crackle of the hospital's internal system restoring its function after the morning's communication failure. All available clinical staff, Trauma Bay 1. This is not a drill. Repeat, Trauma Bay 1. Claire was already moving before the message finished. She came through the stairwell door to the ground floor and turned toward Trauma Bay 1 and saw immediately that the controlled intensity of the morning had become something else. Tighter, faster, the nurses moving with the specific urgency that is reserved for the situations where the margin has disappeared. Voss. Post-op patients don't typically come back to the ER. That they'd brought him down from the surgical floor meant the surgical floor couldn't manage what was happening, which meant whatever was happening fast. She pushed through the bay curtain. Hollis was there. She'd come back or hadn't left, which was possible given the day's compounding events. Her expression when she looked at Claire had something in it that wasn't panic, but was the next county over from panic. "He's throwing a clot," Hollis said. "Pulmonary. It came on in the last 15 minutes. Pulmonary embolism, post-abdominal surgery, trauma patient." Claire's mind was already running the calculus. Anticoagulation, thrombolysis, the timing of each against his recent surgical intervention, the risk profile of a man who'd had his abdomen opened 4 hours ago and now needed the exact thing that would put that repair at risk. "How extensive?" she said. "Bilateral. Saddle embolism, probably." Hollis's voice was tight but controlled. "I need another set of eyes on this. The intervention options are all bad," Claire said. Wasn't pessimism, it was accuracy. "All carry significant risk given the surgical site, yes." Hollis looked at the monitor. Voss's oxygen saturation was declining in a way that numbers on screens make look gradual, but that in reality is not. "Thrombolysis could reopen the repair. Catheter-directed therapy is what I'd want, but our interventional radiology team—" "Is Dr. Rourke available?" Hollis stopped. "Rourke retired. His replacement. Dr. Sayer, she's been here 4 months. 4 months. Claire did the fast triage of that information. "Is she good?" "I don't know yet," Hollis said, which was honest and not helpful and entirely fair. "Get her, right now, and get me the thrombolysis protocol. I want to know exactly where the surgical repair is relative to the clot burden before we make any decision." She was at the monitor already, reading the numbers in the specific way that turns numbers back into a person. "And someone get Patel on the radio. I need to know when Doyle is stable enough that she can consult if we need her." "You want a neurosurgeon in a pulmonary case?" "I want every resource I have in the building available if this goes sideways." She looked at Hollis directly. "He survived the surgery. He's not dying from a clot. Not today." Hollis held her gaze for a second. Then she turned and started giving orders. The next 40 minutes were the kind of 40 minutes that compress and stretch simultaneously. Each decision its own distinct territory, each action feeding into the next with a logic that is only visible if you know what you're looking for. Dr. Sayer arrived in 11 minutes, which, given that she'd been off-site, was faster than expected. And she was quiet and certain in her assessment, and Claire recalibrated immediately, moving Sayer from unknown quantity to asset. They made the call together, Hollis and Sayer and Claire, in the 30-second window between one set of vitals and the next. Catheter-directed thrombolysis, targeted, with the surgical team on immediate standby to respond to the repair site if the anticoagulation caused what they all understood it might cause. It was not a clean decision. It was the least bad option from a selection of bad options, which is what medicine actually is when it's doing its hardest work. Sayer took the lead, and Claire stayed in the room, and Hollis stayed in the room, and nobody said anything that wasn't directly necessary for the next 40 minutes. At the 41-minute mark, Voss's saturation stopped declining. At 47 minutes, it began, slowly, imperfectly, in the halting way that real improvement moves rather than the smooth curve it looks like in textbooks, to rise. Hollis made a sound that was mostly exhale. Sayer looked at the monitor without moving for several seconds. Then she looked at Claire. "It's working," she said, in the voice of someone who has done this enough times to know that working and finished are not the same thing. "Keep watching it," Claire said. "We're not done yet." She was right, they weren't. Because 20 seconds later, the bay curtain moved and Marcus was there. And his face had the expression that had been living on various faces in this building all day. The face of someone arriving with information that changes the shape of what comes next. "Dawson," he said. "The corridor. Now." She looked at the monitors, stable enough. Sayer was there. Hollis was there. She stepped out. In the corridor, Marcus was not alone. Captain Reyes was beside him. And beside Reyes was a man Claire hadn't seen before. Military bearing, mid-50s, in the kind of dress uniform that doesn't get worn to routine events. He was looking at her with an expression that she couldn't immediately categorize. "Ms. Dawson," Reyes said, "this is Brigadier General Paul Okafor. He came in with the second convoy." Okafor extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was deliberate. "Colonel Voss is my officer," he said. "Captain Reyes has briefed me on everything that's happened in this building today. Everything." He looked at her steadily. "I've also just come from a briefing with Special Agent Forsyth." She waited. "There's something you need to know," he said, "about why the transport vehicle was on that road this morning." The corridor was quiet. The ER behind them was controlled, managed, doing what emergency departments do. Outside, through the lobby glass, she could see that the afternoon had moved on without anyone's permission. The light changed, the parking lot emptying and refilling in its ordinary rhythm. "The transport route was changed 12 hours ago," Okafor said, "by someone inside this hospital, someone who had access to a federal logistics database through a contracted billing interface." He paused. "Someone who knew a federal audit convoy was en route and needed the timeline disrupted." She looked at him. "Quillen," she said. "That's what Forsyth believes," he said. "And if that's confirmed—" He stopped. The muscle along his jaw moved once. "Then what happened this morning to my soldiers was not an accident." The word landed in the corridor between them and did not leave. Behind her, from inside Bay 1, Dr. Sayer's voice called something, not alarmed, directional. And Claire turned back to the curtain because Voss was still not stable enough to leave unattended, and because the work was still the work regardless of what was true outside the bay walls. But as she reached for the curtain, something on the monitor visible through the gap made her hand stop in midair. The number on the display was wrong again, different from before. Not a return of the embolism, something else. Something she had not seen in the workup this morning and had not been present in any of the scans. Her mind processed it in the flat, fast way that experience builds. She stepped back through the curtain, and what she saw on Voss's face was the thing she had been afraid of without naming it. The specific, unmistakable presentation of a man whose body was doing something that the last 4 hours of intervention had not anticipated and was not prepared for. And that left her exactly 5 minutes to figure out what it was before the window for addressing it closed entirely. She read the number and she read his face and she read the monitor all in the same second, and what she understood was this. Voss's heart was doing something that the surgical trauma and the embolism treatment and the anticoagulation had collectively created the conditions for, and the window between addressable and not was measured in minutes rather than the more comfortable unit of hours she'd been working in all day. "Sayer," she said, "look at the rhythm." Sayer looked. A beat passed. "That's atrial fibrillation with rapid ventricular response." Claire was already at the crash cart. The anticoagulation load plus the surgical stress plus whatever autonomic chaos the embolism event created. His heart tipped over. She pulled the drawer. "Get me cardiology on the phone and get the defibrillator ready, but don't charge it yet. I want to try rate control first." "He's post-anticoag... I know what he is. Rate control first. If he deteriorates, we cardiovert." She turned to the nurse nearest the door. "What's his blood pressure right now?" 94/60. Low but not catastrophic. There was room, not much, but room. She administered the rate control medication herself, watching the monitor with the attention of someone for whom numbers have always been language. Not data, but statements, arguments, the body making its case in the only vocabulary it has. The rhythm on the screen was irregular and fast and wrong, and she watched it, and she waited and she did not look away, because sometimes the only thing between a patient and the worst outcome is the vigilance of someone paying absolute attention. 40 seconds, 70. The rate began to slow. Not to normal, not yet. But the frantic irregularity started to find something approaching a pattern, the way a crowd in a panic eventually starts moving in a direction once something gives them a direction to move in. She watched it happen in real time and made two small adjustments and then stepped back one step, which was the physical equivalent of allowing herself to believe it was working. Sayer exhaled. It was a short, controlled exhale, but it was audible. "Holding," she said. "Holding," Claire confirmed. "Get cardiology in here. I don't want to manage this alone through the night." She looked at Voss's face again. He was sedated, his color still off, but not the particular gray that preceded the worst, and something in her chest loosened by a small but significant fraction. "And someone tell General Okafor that his officer is still alive." It took another hour for Voss to fully stabilize. Not a clean hour, not an hour without incident, but an hour at the end of which the cardiologist on call had reviewed everything and agreed with her management approach and made two of his own adjustments that she thought were reasonable. And the monitor was showing a rhythm that was abnormal by textbook standards, but was, for this patient at this moment, functional. Dr. Rafi, the cardiologist, was a careful man who asked good questions and didn't perform his confidence, which she appreciated. When she finally stepped out of the bay for longer than 3 minutes, the ER floor was in its late afternoon register. Not quiet. Emergency departments don't do quiet, but the particular sustained intensity of morning had resolved into something more distributed. The military presence was thinner now. 2 personnel at the entrance, Reyes somewhere in the building still, the armored vehicles gone from the ambulance bay and replaced by a single unmarked car that belonged, she assumed, to someone still working upstairs. Marcus found her at the nursing station. "How is he?" asked. "Stable enough that I'm willing to stand here for 5 minutes without my eyes on the monitor." She picked up the nearest water bottle. Not hers, she noted, but the owner wasn't present and she needed the water, and drank. "What happened while I was in there?" He gave her the kind of summary that good charge nurses give, which is dense and sequenced and contains exactly what she needed and nothing she didn't. Doyle was out of surgery. Patel's procedure had taken 2 hours and 20 minutes, and the initial post-op assessment showed motor response in both feet, which was not a guarantee but was the specific, concrete piece of information that Doyle had asked for before they put him under. Parker, the concussion case, had been cleared for supervised rest and had spent 40 minutes on a borrowed phone talking to his wife in a voice that carried further than he probably intended. The 4th military casualty, a corporal named Restrepo, who had come through the doors with the convoy but whose injuries had been the least severe, had been discharged from clinical care 2 hours ago and was somewhere in the building voluntarily, apparently, waiting for word on his colleagues. "And upstairs?" she said. Marcus's expression shifted. "That's the part you should probably hear from Forsyth directly." A pause. "She's been asking where you are for the last 40 minutes. Tell her I'm coming up." She washed her hands at the station sink, not because they needed washing, habit, and looked at the board, and looked at the clock, and did the fast internal inventory of things that were stable versus things that needed her presence. Voss had Rafi. Doyle had Patel. Parker was managed. Restrepo was discharged. The regular ER population, the non-military patients who had been waiting and being seen throughout the entire extraordinary day, had been held together by Marcus and Yolanda and the rest of the staff with a competence that she had relied on and not thanked anyone for yet. She made a note to fix that. Then she went upstairs. Tip. The 3rd floor had settled into the particular stillness that follows a disruption rather than preceding one. The agents who'd been moving through the corridor all day were still present but stationary. The quality of their attention changed from active to documentary, gathering, recording, the work of building what would eventually become a legal case rather than the work of stopping something from happening. Forsyth was in the conference room with the door open. She looked up when Claire appeared in the doorway. "Sit down," she said, and this time it was less directive and more an offer. Claire sat. The table between them had more documents on it than that morning. Physical files, printed records, things that had been pulled from servers and filing systems and reduced to paper because paper is what the legal process eventually requires. On the laptop beside Forsyth, she could see the surveillance footage interface, paused on a frame. Voss? Forsyth asked first. Stabilized, cardiac event, managed. He's not out of the woods entirely, but he's in the right section of the forest. Something moved across Forsyth's face that was not entirely professional. She'd been in this building for 11 weeks of investigation, Claire understood, which meant she'd been building a case around a set of people who were abstractions until today, and now some of those abstractions were in hospital beds, and one of them had been in active cardiac distress 40 minutes ago. That lands differently than a file. Quillen has been processed and transferred to federal holding, Forsyth said, moving back to her mode. He declined to cooperate initially, then his attorney reviewed what we have from the surveillance archive and advised him to reconsider. She tapped a finger on the table. He's been talking for 3 hours. What's he saying? A great deal. Most of it confirms what we already knew and fills in some gaps. Forsyth opened the folder on top of the stack. The billing fraud began 3 years and 2 months ago. The original architect was the previous CFO, who retired, conveniently, about 8 months into the scheme. Quillen continued it and expanded it. Merritt was brought in 14 months ago with full knowledge of the existing structure. He was, in fact, selected for this role in part because of his history at a previous institution where a similar pattern was allowed to run without consequence. Claire looked at the folder. She didn't touch it. So it was deliberate. His hiring was deliberate, yes. Forsyth paused. What Merritt brought to this arrangement was a specific skill, the management of internal dissent. The previous CFO's operation was functional but vulnerable to staff reporting. Merritt knew how to handle that. He'd done it before. She looked at Claire. Your reports weren't the first ones he'd intercepted and suppressed. He had a methodology. Flag the reports at the administrative gateway, route them to a subfolder that Quillen monitored, assess the risk level of the reporting party, and respond with either the reprimand file or the forced withdrawal approach, depending on the individual. The reprimand in my file, Claire said, 14 months ago. That was him. Yes, that reprimand was placed in your file 3 days after he started. He reviewed the historical record of every clinician who'd previously filed complaints and pre-positioned disciplinary notations where he thought they'd be useful as leverage. Forsyth held her gaze. You were on a list, Ms. Dawson. Not because of anything you did after he arrived, because of what you'd done before. She sat with that for a moment. The specific feeling of understanding that a thing you experienced as personal was actually structural, that you were never the unique target of a specific malice, but rather one item on a managed list. It was not better. It was a different kind of worse. How many people were on the list, she asked. 11 clinical staff across 3 departments. 4 of them resigned over the last 14 months, 1 transferred to another facility. 3 received formal reprimands that were used to suppress subsequent reports. Forsyth's voice was even. You're the only one who kept filing. The corridor outside was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. What happens to the people who resigned? Claire asked. They'll be contacted. Their employment records will be corrected. Whether they choose to return to Stonegate is their own decision. Forsyth closed the folder. What I need from you now is a complete formal statement. Everything from this morning and everything you remember from the last 6 weeks. The dates you filed, what you observed, any conversations with Merritt or Quillen or any administrative staff that relate to the suppression. She pushed a legal pad across the table. Take as much time as you need. I'll have someone bring you coffee. Claire looked at the legal pad. Then she picked up the pen and started writing. She wrote for 40 minutes. She wrote with the same specificity she'd brought to the incident reports. Dates, times, exact language when she remembered it, approximations clearly marked as approximations, the distinction between what she'd witnessed directly and what she'd been told by others. She wrote about the morning's events last. When she got to the part where Fawkes had held the door and she'd walked through it, she paused for a moment. Then she wrote it anyway. Forsyth reviewed the statement while Claire was still sitting there. She read it the way lawyers and investigators read things. Not for narrative, but for structure, looking for gaps, testing the internal logic. At 2 points, she asked a clarifying question. Claire answered both. Then Forsyth set the pages down and looked at her. This is solid, she said. This will hold. Good, Claire said. She was standing to leave when Forsyth said, "One more thing." She stopped. "The transport route change." Forsyth's voice had changed to register again. Not investigator to witness, but something more direct. "We've confirmed it. The Federal Logistics Database was accessed through a billing contract interface at 11:47 p.m. last night. The access credentials used belong to Quillen. The route modification was entered under a service flag that would read as a maintenance update, not a security event." Claire turned around. "The convoy carrying the federal audit materials? The same audit that would have triggered mandatory external review of Stonegate's billing records, was rerouted onto the interchange approach that runs through the Hargrove construction corridor." Forsyth's hands were flat on the table. "That section of road has a posted speed restriction that the federal transport was not advised of. The combination of the modified route and a mechanical issue with the lead vehicle at highway speed resulted in what happened this morning." The room was very quiet. "He tried to intercept the audit," Claire said. Not a question. "He tried to delay it, destroy the materials, create enough disruption that the federal team would need to regroup and resubmit the audit request, which would have bought him at minimum several weeks and potentially triggered a jurisdictional dispute that could have extended that by months." Forsyth looked at her. 4 soldiers were in that convoy. 4 soldiers. Voss with his post-surgical cardiac event still being monitored 2 floors down. Doyle in post-op with his spine, with the fragment that had shifted during transport and taken his sensation and might or might not fully restore it. Parker with his concussion, calling his wife. Restrepo, discharged and waiting in a building he didn't need to be in anymore, waiting because leaving felt wrong when his colleagues were still patients. "Does Merritt know about this part?" she asked. "He's known for approximately 2 hours. His attorney has been in active renegotiation of his cooperation agreement since then." Forsyth paused. "Attempted interference with a federal investigation is one charge. What happened on that highway this morning is something different, and Merritt, apparently, is very clear on the difference." She came back down to the clinical floor, and the first person she saw was Priya. It was an ordinary moment in its mechanics. They passed each other near the nursing station, Priya coming off a task, Claire heading toward Bay 1 for a Voss check, and it was anything but ordinary in what it carried. Priya stopped. Claire stopped. The ER moved around them in its continuous present tense. "Forsyth told me," Claire said. Priya's face did several things. She was 34, had worked this floor for 6 years, had a steadiness that Claire had always relied on and never said so. Right now she looked tired and slightly frightened, and also something else. The specific expression of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has recently been allowed to set it down. "I didn't know if it would do anything," Priya said, forwarding the reports. "I didn't know if anyone was actually looking." "Someone was. I should have told you I was doing it." "You were protecting yourself," Claire said. "That was right. You had to be able to deny knowledge if Merritt came after you." She paused. "The documentation you gave them, 8 months of it." Priya looked at the floor briefly. "I kept thinking someone official would do it first, and then they didn't, and I kept keeping notes. And eventually I had—" She stopped. "I didn't want to be the only one who knew what was happening in here." Claire looked at her. "You weren't," she said. "You just didn't know the others yet." Priya's jaw moved. She nodded once, tightly, and then someone called her name from the station, and she went, and Claire went toward Bay 1, and the ER did what it does. Voss was awake for the first time, not coherent, partially sedated, intermittently aware, his eyes opening and closing with the effortful rhythm of someone surfacing from a depth, but awake enough that when Claire came to the bedside and said his name, something in his face reorganized in response. "Colonel Voss?" "I'm Claire Dawson. I'm the nurse who's been managing your care today." His eyes found her, focused slowly. "Reyes," he said. His voice was barely there, a thin, hoarse version of what it probably was. "She's in the building. She's fine." "My team." "Doyle is in post-op. Spine surgery went well. Early signs are positive. Harker is resting, Restrepo was discharged, and is currently sitting in your waiting area refusing to leave. She paused. They're all here. He closed his eyes, opened them again. You, he said. Me, she agreed. He seemed to be working through something. Reyes told me. Your record. His breathing was labored but controlled. Why did you... He stopped, gathered something. Why civilian medicine? She looked at him. It was not the question she'd expected from a man who'd been through what he'd been through in the last 12 hours, which meant it was probably not a new question, probably one that had been sitting somewhere for a while waiting for the right moment, the way important questions do. I needed a different kind of work, she said, after a while. Something where I had the same people around me for more than a deployment cycle. She paused. I'm not sure I made the right call, but I made a call. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes were working hard to stay open. You made the right call, he said. Today. She didn't answer that. She checked his numbers. The rhythm still abnormal but held. The pressure improved from the morning's valley, the saturation at a level that Rafi had said he was satisfied with. And then she made a note in the chart and stepped back. Rest, she said. His eyes closed. She stayed for another 30 seconds to be sure, then stepped out. What? General Okafor found her in the corridor with the particular directness of a man who has been waiting for a specific moment and has decided this is it. He was not alone. Reyes was with him, and behind them, slightly removed, were two people in civilian clothes that Claire had not seen before, but who had the specific bearing of people who were here in an official capacity that was different from the OIG investigation. Ms. Dawson, Okafor said, I want to introduce someone. The woman who stepped forward was perhaps 60, with the composed bearing of someone accustomed to rooms where things are decided. She said her name, Deputy Director Hargrove, from an office Claire recognized as a federal medical oversight body. And she shook Claire's hand with the specific firmness of someone who has reviewed a file and has decided the person in front of them is worth the firmness. I've been in contact with our office for the last 2 hours, Hargrove said. We're initiating an emergency administrative review of Stonegate Medical Center effective immediately. That review will determine the scope of operational intervention, staffing oversight, and interim leadership structure for this facility pending the conclusion of the OIG investigation. She paused. We're also formally requesting that any suspension or disciplinary action issued against clinical staff in relation to the events under investigation be stayed pending review. That includes your suspension of this morning. Claire looked at her. Stayed means suspended but not active? Stayed means nullified pending outcome, which in cases like this is almost always full reversal. Hargrove's voice was precise. In plain language, you're working tonight if you choose to be. The administrative action against you has no standing while our review is in process. From somewhere behind Hargrove, Okafor was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully decode, something between professional respect and the particular attention of a person who has seen a thing they did not fully expect. I'm aware, Hargrove continued, that today has been an extraordinary day for this department and for you personally. If you need time... I don't need time, Claire said. I need a badge. Hargrove glanced at Reyes. Something passed between them. Then Reyes reached into her jacket and produced Claire's original badge, the one that had been collected during her removal that morning, that had presumably been sitting in whatever administrative drawer Merritt had put it in, and held it out. Claire took it. The plastic was cool against her fingers. She looked at it for exactly as long as it took to clip it back to her pocket. Thank you, she said. It was the last moment of anything resembling stillness for the rest of that evening. What followed was not a dramatic reversal. It was work, which is what reversals actually look like when they happen in real places rather than in the constructed version of events. It was rounds and chart reviews and a difficult conversation with Patel about Doyle's post-surgical management and a longer conversation with Rafi about the overnight cardiac monitoring protocol for Voss, and two separate situations in the regular ER population that had been deferred slightly in the extraordinary circumstances of the day and now needed full attention. It was Marcus handing over the charge responsibilities at shift change with a handoff that lasted 20 minutes because the day had generated 20 minutes of handoff. It was Yolanda at the end of her shift standing at the station looking at nothing in particular with the face of someone who has been running hard and has only just stopped. "Go home," Claire told her. "I'm fine." "You've been here since 6 this morning. Go home." Yolanda looked at her. "You've been here since 6 this morning and you haven't left." "I was fired and rehired today. My schedule is complicated." She touched Yolanda's arm briefly. "You were excellent today. I need you back tomorrow." Yolanda picked up her bag. She paused on her way out. "Dawson." "Yeah." "When Merritt walked you out this morning." She stopped, started again. "I wanted to say something and I didn't." "I know." "I'm sorry." "Don't be," Claire said. "It cost you something to stay quiet this morning, and I know that. It would have cost you more to speak up, and you knew that too. That's not a personal failure. That's the system working exactly as Merritt designed it to work." She held Yolanda's gaze. "That's the whole point of what he built here, to make the cost of speaking up higher than most people can pay. What you did was survive it." Yolanda nodded once, the kind of nod that holds more than a nod usually has to hold. Then she left. Claire went back to the floor. At 8:47 p.m., Harlan Merritt was escorted out of the main entrance of Stonegate Medical Center by 2 federal agents. Not the administrative entrance, not a service exit. The main entrance, through the lobby, past the volunteer desk and the information board, and the plastic chairs of the public waiting area, which at that hour held 11 people who all looked up when the doors opened from the interior corridor. Claire was not in the lobby when it happened. She was in the ER, doing her job. She heard about it afterward, from Marcus, who had been near the elevator bay and had seen it, and who described it with the careful precision of someone who had worked for Merritt for 2 years and was still calibrating how to feel about what that had meant. "He didn't say anything," Marcus said. "He just walked." She nodded. She'd expected something from him. A statement, a deflection, the instinct of a man accustomed to managing perception to manage it until the last possible moment. But maybe walking quietly was its own statement. Maybe, by then, he simply had nothing left to perform. "What about his attorney?" she asked. "Followed him out, on his phone before the door closed." She filed that away and went back to the board. At 10:15 p.m., Forsyth sent a message to her personal phone, not to the hospital system, to her personal number, which meant she'd found it somewhere in the course of the day. It said, "Quillen's cooperation agreement is confirmed. 7 additional individuals named. 3 of them are not hospital staff. Federal warrants are being processed. You'll be contacted in the next 48 hours about testimony scheduling." She read it twice, then put her phone away. At 10:52 p.m., as she was reviewing overnight orders at the nursing station when she heard footsteps in the corridor that were slightly uneven, the walk of someone navigating a space on legs they weren't completely certain of yet. She looked up. Doyle was in the doorway to the ER corridor. He had a nurse on each side, which was appropriate for a patient who'd been out of spinal surgery for 7 hours, and he was wearing a hospital gown and looked like he'd been through considerably more than one day, which was an accurate representation. He was also, unmistakably, standing on his own feet. She set down the chart. He saw her across the room and something in his face changed. Not relief exactly, more like the completion of something that had been suspended all day, a circuit closing. He lifted one hand, very slightly. Not a wave, an acknowledgement. She lifted her chin in return. He was walked back to his room. She went back to the chart. The ER moved around her in its continuous present tense, the work indifferent to everything that had happened today, because the work is always indifferent to history and is always only now. She was fine with that. She had always been fine with that. It was nearly midnight when Okafor came back to the floor. She'd thought he'd left. He had no remaining clinical reason to be in the building, but he hadn't. He came to the nursing station with the quiet of someone who'd been somewhere else in the building doing something she wasn't aware of, and he stood across the desk from her with his hands folded in a way that was very deliberate. "There's something you should know," he said. She waited. "The review team from Deputy Director Hargrove's office has been in the building since this afternoon. As part of the emergency administrative assessment, they've been pulling staffing records, operational logs, and clinical outcome data for the last 3 years. He paused. They found something that isn't part of the billing fraud case. She looked at him. A clinical incident, 14 months ago. A patient discharged against medical advice under bed pressure protocols. The patient experienced a cardiac event at home 8 hours after discharge. He held her gaze steadily. The internal review at the time attributed the decision to the attending physician. That determination is in the record as a formal finding. He paused. The review team found a secondary file, a dissenting report, filed the same day as the official finding, that attributed the discharge decision to administrative pressure on the attending and identified the bed pressure protocol as the contributing cause. She said nothing. That dissenting report was filed by a senior ER nurse, Okafor said. It was marked as received, processed, and resolved. It was never actually reviewed. It was placed in a system archive folder that required administrative credentials to access and was effectively invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. His voice was level and careful. The reprimand that was placed in your file 14 months ago, the one that Merritt then used as leverage to characterize you as a problematic employee, was issued 4 days after that dissenting report was filed and suppressed. The nursing station was quiet. The ER behind her was doing its night shift rhythm, different from days, lower volume, but no less constant. The reprimand was retaliation, she said. Yes. From the previous administration. Yes. He paused. Which means Merritt didn't build a targeting file from scratch when he arrived. He inherited one that had already been built for him, flagging you as a known risk. A clinician who filed reports, who didn't withdraw them, and who had already been given an official sanction that could be used to undermine her credibility if she filed again. He let that settle for a moment. The review team flagged this 2 hours ago. Forsyth's office has been notified. It expands the scope of the investigation significantly. She looked at her hands on the desk. She was very still. How many others? She said. They're still pulling records, but you're not the first. She had known that, in the way that experienced clinicians always know the shape of institutional dysfunction, even when they can't see its full architecture. You feel it in the resistance, in the specific texture of the responses when you push against the walls. But knowing the shape and having the evidence are different, and the evidence was now in the hands of people with the authority to use it. There's one more thing, Okafor said, and his voice had shifted slightly. Not to something softer, more to something more deliberate. Hargrove's office will be making a formal recommendation regarding interim operational leadership for this facility during the review period. Standard procedure is to appoint someone from within the regional health authority. He paused. She asked me before I came down here whether I thought there was internal clinical leadership at Stonegate worth considering for an advisory role in the interim structure. She looked at him. I told her yes, he said. I told her specifically, yes. The night shift nurse coming to relieve the position nearest her arrived at that moment and began the handoff with the ordinary efficiency of a transition, pulling the chair, reviewing the board, asking 2 quick questions, doing the invisible work of continuity that keeps patients alive through the hours when the building is quieter and the risks don't stop. Claire answered the questions and stepped aside and let the transition happen. When she looked back, Okafor was still there. You'll be contacted tomorrow, he said. I wanted you to know it was coming. He left. The night shift settled in around her. She had 3 more hours on her shift and no intention of leaving a minute early, and an ER that needed exactly what she'd been doing all day, which was her full attention applied to one problem at a time in the order the problems arrived. She picked up the next chart. It was a 48-year-old man in Bay 3, presenting with acute abdominal pain, referred by an urgent care clinic, preliminary blood work showing elevated white count. The triage note said he'd been waiting for 40 minutes. She read it once, absorbed it, and moved toward the bay. She was 3 steps down the corridor when her pager went off. Not her clinical pager, which she'd been managing all day, but a different frequency. A number she didn't recognize. A Federal Exchange prefix she'd seen on Forsyth's communications. She stopped, read the message, read it again. The number it contained was a case file reference, and the name attached to the case file was not Merritt's name, and it was not Quillen's name, and it was not the name of anyone she'd seen in the administrative wing today. It was a name she recognized from a different context entirely, from a contract signatory she'd seen on a federal billing document in one of her incident reports, a name she'd noted and not known what to do with, a name that connected Stonegate's billing fraud not to a local scheme run by two administrators, but to a network of facilities across 3 states operating under the same methodology. The message below it was 4 words. "We need to talk." She stood in the corridor with the pager in her hand and read the message a 3rd time, not because the words were unclear, but because she needed a moment between what she'd understood and what she was going to do about it. The case file number was real, the name attached to it, a man named Victor Aldris, listed on 3 of her incident reports as the signatory for a federal billing contract that ran through Stonegate and 2 facilities she'd never heard of, was real. And the implication of those 4 words, "We need to talk," from a federal exchange at near midnight, was that what had happened at Stonegate today was not the whole picture. It was one panel of something larger. She called the number back. Forsyth answered on the 2nd ring, which meant she'd been waiting. "Aldris," Claire said. "We identified him 2 hours ago through Quillen's cooperation statement. He's the contract administrator who structured the billing interface that gave Quillen access to the federal logistics database." Forsyth's voice was not tired, which was something to note given the hour. "He's not a hospital employee. He's a private contractor who works with 7 federally contracted medical facilities across Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. 3 of them are showing preliminary billing anomalies consistent with what we found at Stonegate." So Stonegate wasn't the origin. Stonegate was the most developed instance, but no. Aldris appears to be the architect of the methodology. Quillen and the previous CFO adapted it locally, but the template came from somewhere else. A pause. "We executed a warrant on Aldris tonight. He's in federal custody. I wanted you to know before you read it somewhere else tomorrow." She leaned against the corridor wall, not from exhaustion exactly, though she was exhausted, more from the specific weight of understanding that the thing you thought was one contained problem was actually a root system, and the root system was deeper and wider than anyone standing in the hospital today had fully seen. "The patients," she said, "at the other facilities will be reviewed, all of them." Forsyth's voice carried the particular weight of someone who has said that sentence before and knows it represents an enormous amount of work, and says it anyway because it is true. "That's going to take time, but it's started." "Okay," Claire said. "Get some sleep, Ms. Dawson." She almost laughed. "I've got 2 hours left on shift." "Then get some sleep after that." A pause that wasn't quite professional. "You did well today. I'm not sure that's been said clearly enough." She thanked her and ended the call and stood in the corridor for one more moment. Then she put the pager in her pocket and went to see the man in Bay 3 with the elevated white count and the abdominal pain who had been waiting 40 minutes and whose problem was real and immediate and hers to solve. The investigation became a public matter on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the day the helicopters came. The OIG held a press briefing in Portland that ran 47 minutes and outlined, in the specific, dense language of federal legal process, the charges against Harlan Merritt, Brennan Quillen, Victor Aldris, and 4 other individuals across the contractor network: Medicare fraud, obstruction of federal investigation, falsification of medical records, reckless endangerment. That charge applied to the transport route change, and it was the one that the press briefing returned to most because it was the one that was hardest to make abstract. 4 soldiers had been in that vehicle. They were alive, which was the outcome, but the outcome had required a specific set of circumstances to produce it, and those circumstances were not guaranteed. Claire watched the briefing on her phone in the break room during a 20-minute gap between patients. She watched it alone. At the point where Forsyth, standing at the podium, said the words "deliberate suppression of clinical staff reporting over a period of not less than 14 months, Claire paused the video and sat with it for a moment. 14 months. The reprimand. The list she'd been on before she'd done anything to deserve being on it. The report she'd filed and the silence she'd received, and the morning 3 weeks ago when Falks had held the door and she'd walk through it with her jacket and her water bottle and a photograph she didn't look at. She pressed play and finished watching. The formal hearing that determined the status of Stonegate Medical Center's operational leadership was held in the third week of October, in a building downtown that smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee. Claire attended because she'd been asked to, and because her formal statement was part of the record, and because she had learned that the work of justice, unlike the work of medicine, which sometimes resolves quickly and cleanly, requires your presence in rooms where things move slowly and procedurally and without drama. Deputy Director Hargrove chaired the panel. There were 7 people on it, including a representative from the State Medical Board, a federal healthcare administrator, and a patient advocate whose presence Claire found, in a way she didn't entirely expect, genuinely reassuring. The hearing was not about her. It was about the facility, its operational status, its compliance requirements going forward, the structure of oversight that would govern it during the reform period and after. She gave her statement when called and answered questions for 22 minutes and said nothing she hadn't already said in her written submission. What she noticed in the room was that several of the nurses who had worked the overnight shifts, the understaffed ones, the ones she'd flagged in her reports, were also present. Priya was there. So was a nurse named Devon, who had worked at Stonegate for 11 years and had filed 1 report in that time and received a verbal reprimand for it within a week and filed nothing after. They all gave statements. Not all of them were composed the entire way through, which was appropriate and human, and which the panel did not hurry past. After the hearing, in the lobby, Devon stopped beside her. He was in his early 40s, tall, with the particular quietness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that they've forgotten what it's like to put it down. "I should have kept filing," he said. He wasn't looking for absolution. He was just saying it. "You should have had a system that made it safe to file," she said. "That's different." He thought about that. "Maybe both are true." "Yeah," she said. "Maybe both are true." The hearing's findings came through 9 days later. Stonegate Medical Center would continue operating under an emergency oversight structure, with an external administrator appointed by the federal review body to govern operations during the reform period. The existing administrative team, what remained of it after the arrests, was formally dissolved. New governance protocols would be implemented and audited quarterly for a period of 3 years. All clinical staff who had received retaliatory disciplinary actions during the period under review would have those records expunged. The bed pressure discharge protocol that had produced the retaliatory reprimand in Claire's file 14 months before Merritt arrived was identified as a contributing causal factor in the broader pattern and was permanently suspended pending development of a replacement with patient safety as the governing criterion. Merritt entered a guilty plea on the federal obstruction charge 11 days after his arrest. The fraud charges proceeded separately, and his cooperation agreement, which he'd been renegotiating since the moment the agents put his transport route evidence on the table, had been accepted. It bought him mitigation at sentencing, not freedom. The difference between those two things, his attorney had apparently explained, was that he was going to federal prison either way, but had the option of going for a shorter period of time. Quillen did not cooperate. His attorney argued insufficient evidence on 2 of the secondary charges. The judge heard the arguments and then heard the evidence, which included 11 months of surveillance footage and the testimony of a contract administrator who had already pleaded guilty and had nothing left to protect. Quillen was convicted on 7 counts. Aldris, who had built the framework that enabled all of it, who had treated federal healthcare billing as a mechanism for extraction across 7 facilities, and had reached into a logistics database and changed a number on a route map because he thought 4 soldiers in a transport vehicle were an acceptable cost. Aldris was the last to be processed and the most thoroughly charged. His trial was still pending when the fall came, and it would continue to be pending for a while longer, because federal fraud cases at that scale take time. But it was happening. The machinery was in motion. It didn't stop. 3 weeks after this hearing, Claire was called into a meeting at Stonegate that she'd been told by Hargrove's office to treat as preliminary rather than definitive, which she understood to mean that they'd already made a decision and wanted to see how she responded to the offer before making it official. The meeting was in the conference room on the 3rd floor. Not the one where Merritt had sat with his attorney. The smaller one, with the window that looked out over the hospital parking lot, and past it, the narrow strip of the Hargrove Avenue tree line. Hargrove was there? So was the external administrator, a woman named Patricia Kell, 50s, direct, who ran meetings the way efficient people run meetings, which is by not running them any longer than they need to be run. We're building the interim clinical leadership structure, Kell said, and we have a specific gap in ER operational oversight that we need to address before we can move the rest of the reform framework forward. She paused. We want someone who knows this floor, who knows the patient population, and who has demonstrated, in the most specific and consequential way imaginable, that they'll protect both when the institutional pressure goes the other way. Claire looked at her. You're offering me a position. Director of Emergency Clinical Operations, interim designation, with permanent review at the end of the reform period. Kell slid a document across the table. It comes with everything that title implies: staffing authority, protocol development, direct line to the oversight board on patient safety issues. No administrative gatekeeper between you and the people making decisions about this facility. She looked at the document. She didn't pick it up yet. I want something in writing, she said, not just a title. I want the reporting structure in the charter. I want patient safety reports to route directly to the oversight board with a mandatory response timeline. I want the staffing minimums codified, not advisory. She paused. And I want the people who filed reports during the merit period, all 11 of them, including the 4 who resigned, to receive written confirmation that their records have been corrected and that the door back here is open if they choose it. Kell and Hargrove exchanged a look that was brief and communicative. Those are reasonable conditions, Hargrove said. They're not conditions, Claire said. They're the job. If those things aren't part of the job, I'm not the right person for it. Kell almost smiled. We'll get you the charter language by end of week. Claire picked up the document. She didn't tell anyone immediately. She went back to the floor and finished her shift and told Marcus on the way out, briefly, and his face did something she didn't want to be sentimental about, so she moved past it quickly. She told Priya the next morning, in the break room, over coffee, that was better than the break room coffee had any right to be because someone had brought in a real bag. Priya was quiet for a moment. That's good, she said. That's genuinely good. I might be terrible at it. You'll be terrible at the paperwork. You'll be fine at everything else. Claire laughed. It surprised her slightly. Not the laughing, but how it felt, which was uncomplicated and present in a way that the last several weeks hadn't allowed for much of. Priya was right that she would be terrible at the paperwork. She was also right about the everything else, probably. I'm going to need people I trust, Claire said. Priya looked at her over her coffee cup. Obviously. Mary said, the ceremony was Okafor's idea. She would have said no to it if she'd been consulted in advance, which was probably why she wasn't. She arrived at the Stonegate Auditorium on a Tuesday morning in November, expecting what she'd been told she was coming to, a departmental briefing on the new patient safety reporting structure, and found instead approximately 90 people in a room that had been set up for something more formal than a briefing. Okafor was at the front of the room. So was Reyes. So, in a row of chairs to one side were Voss, Doyle, Harker, and Restrepo, all of them in dress uniform, all of them doing the things soldiers do when they're being asked to sit still in a room, tolerating it with reasonable dignity. Doyle was walking without assistance. She noticed that first. He walked with a careful deliberateness that told her his physical therapy was ongoing and that he was pushing the pace of it in the way that people like him push every pace. But he was walking, and the 6 weeks between that morning in radiology and this room had been enough for his spine to tell him something he'd been waiting to hear. He caught her eye when she came in and did the same thing he'd done in the ER that night. The slight lift of one hand, the acknowledgement. She returned it. Voss was sitting upright with the careful posture of a man whose body is still in negotiation with what happened to it, but his color was right and his eyes were clear, and when she came down the aisle he watched her with the expression she'd seen fragments of in the bay when he'd been surfacing from sedation. The particular attention of someone who is used to assessing people and has reached a conclusion he finds satisfying. She sat where Okafor directed her, in the front row, which she found uncomfortable and did not say so. Okafor spoke first, and he was precise and not overly long about it, which she respected. He described the events of that day in the flat, accurate language of someone reporting to a room that deserved accuracy rather than performance. He named each of his soldiers and their injuries and their current status. He named what Claire had done, and he named her military record, all of it, in public, in front of 90 people. And he did not frame it as a surprise because the people in this room deserved to understand that it had always been true and that the institution around her had chosen not to know it. Then Voss stood. He was not a man who talked about things he didn't need to talk about. She had intuited that from 40 minutes at his bedside when he was barely conscious, from the way he used words sparingly even when drifting in and out of sedation. He stood in front of the room and he looked at her directly and he said, "This woman is the reason I am standing here." And then he paused and said, "And I don't use that sentence lightly, and I don't want her to deflect it, because the people in this room need to understand what it means." She did not deflect it. It cost her something not to, but she held it. He sat down. Reyes presented the citation. It was from Army Special Operations Medical Command, and it cited specific actions on a specific date, and it used her military title, the one she'd left behind in a specific place and carried with her anyway, because you don't leave those things, you just stop using them. And it was real and documented and would exist in a record that nobody could remove from a subfolder or mark as received in archive without review. When it was over, she stood in front of 90 people who included nurses she'd worked beside for 2 decades, and a patient advocate from the hearing and Devon, who had carried his thing for 11 years, and Priya, who had kept 8 months of notes in a personal file because she didn't know what else to do with the truth. And she said the only thing she actually wanted to say, which was not a speech. "I filed reports," she said. "That's what this was. I filed reports and didn't withdraw them, and a lot of people in this room know what that costs. It cost some of you more than it cost me." She paused. The system was designed to make the cost too high to pay. It nearly worked. What I actually want, standing here, is for the system we build from here to make it so that the next person who sees something wrong doesn't have to spend 23 years deciding whether they can afford to say so. She looked at the room. "That's the job. That's the only thing this is for." She sat down. Okafor said something she half heard. The applause was genuine and not brief. She let it be what it was. Afterward, in the corridor outside the auditorium, Doyle found her. He was moving carefully, his physical therapist somewhere behind him doing the patient work of following at the right distance without hovering. "You knew," he said, "that morning, before the surgery, you knew there was a real window." "I thought there was," she said. "I wasn't certain." "But you said we'd find out. Not that it was bad, because it wasn't certain yet. And because scared people need the truth, not the worst version of it." He thought about that. "That's a harder thing to do than it sounds." "Yes," she said. "It is." He put out his hand. She shook it. His grip was solid. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. She did not say it was nothing, because it wasn't nothing, and they both knew that, and some things are made smaller by the wrong words. She went back to the floor that afternoon because the floor was where the work was, and the work didn't pause for ceremonies. She checked on the board, reviewed the overnight cases, talked to the new charge nurse, a hire from the reform period, competent, a little nervous, which was appropriate, about a protocol update she was implementing for high-acuity triage documentation. At some point in the mid-afternoon, she went past the locker she'd cleaned out 6 weeks ago. She opened it now with the new code, hung up her jacket, and taped the photograph back to the inside of the door. A woman and a younger Claire, somewhere with mountains in the background that she no longer remembered the name of, both of them squinting into sunlight. She looked at it for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she closed the locker. The ER was busy. It was always busy. The ambulance bay doors opened and a new patient came in on a gurney, and the radio in the bay was working correctly, and the overnight staffing levels were what they were supposed to be. And the reports that the nurses filed went where reports were supposed to go and were read by the people who were supposed to read them and responded to within the timelines that were now in the charter. None of this made the work easy. Easy was never the point. The point was that the work was now allowed to be what it was, hard and real, and done by people who were permitted to say what they saw without calculating the cost first. She clipped her badge to her scrub pocket and walked out to the floor. The badge said her name. The name was accurate. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she had always been built to do, in a building that had tried to make her invisible and had failed and would not fail in that direction again. Not on her watch.